you very much, Smriti, for that lovely, generous introduction. And yes, indeed, I have very fond memories of you being there on the survey with me. I'd like to actually also thank INTACH and NIAS both for inviting me to be at this webinar. It's a great opportunity for me to listen and learn from so many wonderful speakers in the last 2 weeks that we have had. And unfortunately, I go last, which means that I have the burden of trying to actually put together a lot of my ideas more succinctly, but also I think also an opportunity I have to reflect on some of the speakers that we have heard previously as in my presentation as I will go through, because a lot of the speakers represent some of the latest research that's been happening on South India's past. So let me begin by screen sharing. And I have approximately 40 minutes for my talk. Is the screen visible to everybody?
Yes, it's fine.
Yeah, that's
fine. And I'm audible okay, right?
Oh, yes.
Yes, all fine.
Okay, so I titled this presentation, Reimagining South India's Pasts, Archaeology, Heritage Making, and the Public. And you will see on this slide, I have a few images. I'd like to talk about the ones in the background first. Some of you may have seen the background image earlier as well in one of the talks, but it's basically a Neolithic era ash mound. An ash mound, which was made out of vitrified cattle dung, which was burnt over a very, very long period of time that created mounds of earth. And you see a lot of the southern Deccan around Raichur, Bellary regions especially, dotted with the landscapes dotted with these kinds of ashy looking monumental size soil structures essentially. This is a place called Kudatini, and in the foreground you see those little ceramic vessels, pottery vessels, which are also from the same site. In the foreground of this image, you will see on the left and the right, I've included the covers of an extremely important, significant, and popular history of South India. Anybody who has read any kind of South Indian history, even in their high school, would be familiar with Professor Neelkanth Shastri, who was writing the history of South India in the middle of the 20th century. And in some ways, it was the first time that a synthesis of what constitutes the South Indian past was being presented to Indians, so to speak. And some of these issues is what I will be focusing on for this talk. So, so I structured this presentation firstly by presenting some trends in archaeological research in South India, and then move on to how we can understand heritage as a theme. Now, I don't presume to actually give you all the answers, nor do I know them. And indeed, the scope of this topic is beyond any one single person as such, and it takes a team, an institution, and probably even a generation to look at these themes. Nonetheless, I will attempt to do so. And then I will hopefully pick up on some thoughts on how academic scholarship on the past of South India is engaging in the public sphere to enhance public interest in knowing more about the past and becoming more aware. So without further ado, let me begin. So to the background of the research in archaeology of South India, as I am an archaeologist, and I will not speak in detail about the kinds of histories and historical research that's been happening, which is also fascinating, or art and architectural history research, which has been happening over the last century or more, which is all very fascinating. I'll restrict myself in the scope of research to the archaeology specifically. But I'd like to begin with a kind of a background to the kind of archaeological research, starting from the 19th century. Very early on in the 19th century itself, the recognition of the southern India, especially the peninsular region, the Deccan region, with connections with North India were fairly established after the decipherment of the Ashokan edicts and the inscriptions. And we've heard about this in previous speakers. Dr. Basu Majumdar from Kolkata gave us an overview of this theme in a detailed manner, actually. So I won't dwell on that, except to say that in the 19th century, there was this inextricable connection drawn of the North India and the South India, with the presence of the Mauryan imperial dynasty as it was thought of, as it extended into the southern peninsula. On the other hand, there was an increasing documentation happening in terms of material culture, things like dolmens, the megaliths, right, which we have also heard about from Dr. Gulapalli's presentation and Dr. Haricharan's presentations as well, and which are known by different names. And of course, Buddhist cave monuments and Brahmanical temple architecture. So South India's past, its material culture, and its relationship to a larger context in South Asia in the late 19th century was this inextricable connection to North. However, the questions that were being focused on was something like this. Did South India have its own indigenous history before the Mauryan imperial presence? Or did the construction of the megaliths, which were said to have similar forms in Europe, suggest that they were made by European settlers? Now, the second question, particularly, I'll say a little bit more on this slide. Meanwhile, again in the late 19th century, colonial officials such as the geologist Robert Brucefoot were finding and doing some systematic archaeological fieldwork in the deep south, and were pushing back the limits of South India's history into a very deep past. In fact, the image that you see of these stones are actually stone tools that were used in the Old Stone Age, or what's called the Paleolithic period in archaeology. It used to be referred to as the stone axe culture in the 19th and early 20th century in Indian archaeological publications. And the presence and the establishment of these kinds of deep histories, pre-Mauryan, so to speak, to connect it with what I was saying previously, necessitated those kinds of questions about, did South India have an indigenous past before the Mauryan presence? Now, this was also plugged in a larger context of the understandings of the South Asian civilizational past itself that was being constructed in colonial scholarship. So for instance, the origins of Indian civilization was being debated in the 18th centuries onwards, right down to the middle of the 20th century, where at least in the 18th and 19th centuries and early 20th century, there was a dominant trend, which was dominated by historical linguists and archaeologists, which was, to put it in a nutshell, can be just called an Aryan debate. And many of you are aware of this notion of the Aryan debate and the theories of invasion, and was there one or was there not one, and all of that. So I won't go into that level of detail, but this is the kind of the background of how the scholarship was in the late 19th century. So within such a debate, Sanskrit was the language of North India's heritage, and of course a glorious past, and was increasingly becoming, was seen as a vehicle for the spread of civilization in larger South Asian subcontinent. However, as also mentioned previously, the developments in South Indian history and archaeology was probably, we can see this as leading to two major trends. One, which saw as a parallel development to how Sanskrit was being looked at for northern South Asia, as the development of Tamil language being looked at in the southern parts, and the fact that it was a kind of repository of a unique civilization and language communities who is said to have a contrasting portrayal to the Sanskritic cultures of coming from the north. And publicly and politically, this came to be articulated more as a Dravidian culture and civilization, as opposed to an Aryanized or an Aryan civilization of North. Secondly, another major trend was the unequivocal presence of distinct material traditions, such as the megaliths, the South Indian Neolithic, with features such as the ash mounds, as I had mentioned, and the unique stone temple architecture from the mid-first millennium CE. And this results in South India's archaeology being almost established as a separate, specialized study. So in a sense, by the middle of the 20th century, people who were looking at the histories of India in general had to look at histories of South India slightly different. So they had to read slightly different chapters. And this explains by 1950, a book like Professor Neelkanth Shastri's History of South India come up as such. So this is the larger context of the historical research. And now, in the interest of time as well, I will jump to the recent developments that I'd like to highlight in South Indian archaeology. I'd refer all of the audience to fantastic publications that are already existing out there. Professor K. Padaya, retired from the Premier Institute of Archaeology, Deccan College Research Institute in Pune, has written several pieces on the developments of archaeology in South Asia as a whole. And Dr. Namita Sugandhi, who works in Karnataka and has also written a fantastic overview on the archaeology of South India within the larger developments of archaeology in South Asia. However, just to highlight some developments in the last 2 or 3 decades. First of all, I think structurally and institutionally, we need to notice that archaeologists have been collaborating both from abroad and in India in undertaking research projects in the last 2-3 decades. And this is especially true of archaeologists coming from the United Kingdom and the USA and collaborating with the Archaeological Survey of India in its various state regional offices, including a lot of archaeological departments, which are also double up as heritage and museums departments in various state governments in India. So this is in my opinion, a positive development towards general archaeological research in South Asia in general and South India in particular. And post-colonial developments in research in Indian archaeology did not cut off the presence of foreign researchers. Secondly, from culture history perspectives, which used to be dominant in the early to the middle of the 20th century, and of which we have heard a lot in the last couple of weeks by various speakers, there is a moving on to new emphases on research, new themes of research, new kinds of questions on research. So questions of chronology and typological sequences of material culture have not quite replaced, but have been subsumed and been superseded by newer sorts of themes, such as socioeconomic focus and life-based and economic activities, such as domestication of plants and animals. There's wonderful work that's being done regarding the domestication of crops and plants in southern India, especially, mostly actually spearheaded in the Deccan in South India by Professor Ravi Korishettar and his colleagues, Dorian Fuller, and even people like Professor Kathy Morrison from University of Pennsylvania on issues of how agriculture, how rice begins, how wheat begins, and which regions of South India or South Asia, and at what points in time do these take primacy as opposed to something like a hunting-gathering way of life, and what kind of an impact that has on social complexity or political complexity. So, but I would also say that as far as domestication of animals is concerned, the theme needs urgent research still. Very few people have done this research. And I would say that it's primarily the lack of skill that exists in India, that this research is not being undertaken. And of course, partly it's the kinds of excavation records that are kept in Indian excavations, although that particularly is improving steadily. So there is rock art research, which is happening. In fact, it's taking off in a big way, not just in general in South Asia, but in South India in particular. And that's a welcome move as well, because rock art is now being understood as not a temporally specific human activity. I mean, it never, I could never imagine why art could be a temporally specific activity, but that's how it used to be thought of in archaeological research previously. Rock art from the earliest of times to medieval or late medieval times is being researched on in a longue durée kind of perspective nowadays, with interesting questions of social belongings of communities in landscapes and their perceptions of their surroundings and landscapes and their own pasts being investigated. The second, of course, major trend that we have also heard about in this webinar series are the research on megaliths. These large stone, almost monumental structures that are sometimes memorials, sometimes include burials of human skeletons, sometimes include rich artifact burials alongside, but sometimes just memorial stones as well. But interestingly, the megalithic research is going hand in hand with a lot of artifact research that is emerging from the megaliths. And this is a direct response to the kind of research that megaliths were being subjected to till about 40 years ago, which was to see them as a chronological phase and to see them as a typological kind of an exercise as to which region had what kind of a megalithic. Nowadays, more interesting research regarding what did the artifacts that accompany these stone structures constitute for the living communities. What did it mean that it was taken out of circulation from the living communities and deposited with the dead? And so things like when does social hierarchy begin? When does ranking begin? When does social stratification begin? With leading to issues of social complexity or political formations are becoming the norm of this research from the Iron Age and the megaliths. And of course, as I note here in parentheses in the brackets, these are the names of some of the scholars. Smriti Haricharan, who you just heard from, Pravina Gulapalli, who started off this webinar series, Sharda Srinivasan, who was also a part of this webinar series, Peter Johansson, who has been working from Canada, Kathleen Morrison, Robert Brubaker, U.S. Murthy, who started this trend actually to look at a new way of looking at historiography of the megaliths way back in the 90s. And of course, as a caveat, I would say that it's impossible for me to mention all of the scholars, wonderful scholars' names who are doing wonderful research just in South Indian archaeology. And we are not even talking about archaeology elsewhere in India or South Asia in general. So this is just a flavor that I'm able to provide you about the recent researchers. At this point, I'd like to just also just like to pause and address this theme about a particular material artifact that we all know that archaeologists identify with, pottery, and the so-called tyranny of pottery and chronology. Now, of course, pottery and chronology have gone hand in hand in what I was calling the culture history framework for a better part of the last century. And in some circles, it continues to play an important role in understanding chronology. However, a recent reinvestigation of the ceramic sequences from a very important archaeological site from Karnataka called Brahmagiri by Kathleen Morrison has basically upended and confirmed a lot of suspicions that archaeologists had about how do we understand chronology from pottery. In fact, Mortimer Wheeler, who did the excavations at Brahmagiri in the 1940s and published in 1947-48, actually misidentified some pottery as early historic, which is roughly 300 BC to 300 AD in the southern Indian context, or rather in the general South Asian context. And he thought some of that pottery was the so-called early historic, but radiocarbon dates and reanalysis by Kathleen Morrison in the last 10, 15 years has conclusively established that a lot of this pottery is actually almost from 1,000 years later. So in a way, it is very difficult to rely on this chronology because Brahmagiri's chronology alongside the chronology of another site, which Dr. Selvakumar talked about, Arikamedu, and of course, Professor Radhika Sheshan had also mentioned in her webinar last week, Arikamedu, this important site near Pondicherry, all of this pottery sequences were studied and analyzed and typologized as standard references for a chronological period. And that has been thrown open to critical rethinking nowadays. Instead, what archaeologists like what we heard from Manat Johal, who also presented at the webinar previously, and she mentioned and she told us that pottery has gone beyond simply understanding chronologies. And perhaps pottery can be better indicative of themes such as political economy, social status, indicators of that sort, rather than chronology, which is a less interesting phenomena to learn from pottery studies. So I'd leave that there and move on. However, I would also note that in most archaeological research, we still use the nomenclature of Iron Age, Neolithic, Megalithic, and early historic, early medieval, or things like that. And that's mainly because the archaeological information from excavations and surveys are ordered that way. It's not because research findings are about the chronological analysis per se. In other words, nowadays we recognize that a particular Neolithic settlement, for example, may have actually remains that one might excavate which date to the medieval era of 15th or 16th century. And they are as faithfully documented and researched with other specialists who are specialists of that period of research, as much as the one that the primary researcher might be interested in. A case in point I can speak about here is again Dr. Namita Sugandhi's work at a place called Tekkalkota in Bellary district in North Karnataka, where her own PhD work and subsequent work has thrown up variations and continuities in material culture and settlement and the various sort of occupational phases of the so-called classic Neolithic era occupation at Tekkalkota. For instance, in the field of Neolithic and Iron Age research to do with themes such as social and political complexities, research by people like Andrew Bauer and Peter Johansson in the last decade or so are really shifting the ground of what it means to understand social formations, political formations, hierarchical relationships between communities, communities' perceptions about their landscapes from the material culture that existed and was with archaeologists even 50 years ago, but they were not seeing it from those perspectives. Ash mounds, for example, I come back to it, and Peter Johansson, who talks about ash mounds as being a ritual sort of a landscape, is quite a current hypothesis. Then there is research on the late Iron Age, early historic cultures by several senior researchers and younger people as well. Carla Sunopoli, Kathy Morrison, who have been excavating in North Karnataka at sites such as Kadebakle, which have recently been reported on quite heavily, and pottery analysis, bones analysis, metals analysis, architectural analysis, all the aspects that all the material remains that are available from an excavation that one would expect to find is being thoroughly investigated. And of course, there is early historic or early medieval archaeology, where certain newer themes are also coming up. Dr. Uttara Savratan, who's an archaeologist teaching in Mumbai, currently has done her work on urbanism and political control at the site of Banavasi and Gudnapur in South India in Karnataka. And her research is a step which goes beyond looking at urbanism only from the perspective of how large the settlement was, what was the fortification like of such a settlement, which was the old kind of urbanism research. The urbanism research that is more current today, as we heard from Smriti and Carol Upadhyay yesterday also, and of course from Selvakumar as well, is much more in terms of characterizations and people's perceptions. And of course, how much actual elite control was exercised in the shaping of these landscapes. And there are other themes such as sacred landscapes or themes such as what roles do memories play, what does identity mean in a pre-modern context. Some of this work I have tried to do in some of my research, and I continue to be interested in these. Then, of course, there's a lot of research from, again, the artifacts that we have heard about in this webinar previously about production, craft specialization, especially emerging fields in South Asia like ethnoarchaeology. So all of these scholars have done wonderful work. Professor Shinu Abraham has done particularly good work with glass beads, and this Professor Selvakumar or Professor Radhika Sheshan, who were talking about the Indian Ocean connectivities and Southeast Asia and West Asia and all of this stuff. All of this understandings about South India's past is emerging out of the concrete studies that archaeologists and historians and people who study other materials such as textiles or metal are working in consort with each other to enlighten us on. But I would also notice the fact that there's also a trend, which is not wide, but it is there, of actually revisiting the scholarship itself on South India's past. And people, professors such as Rajan Gurakal, as also Professor Selvakumar mentioned the other day, have been questioning the role that colonial historiography played in the focus on South Indian archaeology in the beginning of the 20th century, particularly, or the middle of the 20th century. And I'd like to add here that something that we need to build towards and go towards as archaeologists, generally speaking, and particularly in South India, with all of this wonderful research that we have been hearing about and exists out there that we haven't heard about, is a scope for contemporary archaeology. With things like ethnoarchaeology and with a lot of understandings about the colonial past. For instance, INTACH's work that on Bangalore city, which is a completely colonial city as most of us know. And of course, I will be talking a little later about the deep past of a city like Bangalore as well. But for the moment, contemporary archaeology is something that has to be undertaken and where archaeologists, I believe, can centrally contribute to understandings of themes such as the past or heritage. All right, so let me move on now to the next part of my presentation, which is actually on heritage. And let me begin by actually addressing everybody by just saying that neither am I an expert on the theme of heritage, nor can I give you all the possible answers, even having done days and months of research on this, because it's something, as I will go through, something that everybody has an opinion on, which is worth visiting. So we need to ask, therefore, but I will also add that there's plenty of academic scholarship on the concept of heritage and what heritage does and how heritage can be done. That does exist, especially in the Euro-American academic scenario, much less in the South Asian scenario, but it is up and coming, but not so much by academicians, but by people who consider themselves as heritage professionals, museum professionals, and the like. So if we begin with a very commonsensical kind of a dictionary kind of understanding of what heritage might feature, I thought I'll just pull this up from the Cambridge dictionary, which says features belonging to a particular society, such as traditions, languages, or buildings that were created in the past, but still have historical importance. And I want us to just look at that phrase that were created in the past, but still have historical importance. And I'll come back to that on the next slide. But the quote below is from this website that advertises for tours for people, interested people all over South India. And these are images from this website of the World Heritage Sites currently in South India. And here's the quote that goes along with the World Heritage Sites of South India from this webpage. From majestic monuments with a breathtaking architecture to a train ride winding through the mountains, get your camera ready to experience the finest globally celebrated examples of South Indian heritage. Now, this sounds extremely familiar to all of us as individuals, as members of communities, whichever community that we might identify with. But it's especially familiar with things like taking a family vacation, taking a trip to a new place, just going to see a place. I mean, something like this is what you would read in the literature, and that would excite you. But all of this is lending itself to a sense of heritage that an individual may or may not have thought of for themselves. So in a way, I'm building towards why I speak about the issue of heritage as heritage making. And I'll support that with this slide as well. By the way, the images here show on the left, it's the Church of the Immaculate Conception in Goa, part of the Churches and Beaches of Goa World Heritage. The top right is the image from the group of monuments at Pattadakal. This is from Pattadakal, but included in this group of monuments is Aihole and Badami. And the bottom right is the famous shore temple of Mamalapuram or Mahabalipuram, a group of temples. And here you can see the image of the Nilgiri mountain train that was in that quote that, I cited previously. Alongside in the bottom, a picture of the Western Ghats, which is part of the natural heritage place that has been designated for India. So the World Heritage not just includes buildings, but also includes intangible heritage, plus also natural heritage, such as the Sundarbans in North India and the Western Ghats in South India. So I'd like to ask the question at this point here, if, as the definition previously cited says, that something that is created in the past but has importance in the present, does that mean that all history becomes heritage? Well, we know that's not the case. If heritages are something then recognized as something from the past, then it can happen and can it happen that something in the contemporary can also become heritage for the future? If heritage is all about something from the past and has historical importance, then who gets to decide what is important? See, these are very difficult questions, and I know all of us probably have very informed opinions about these things. Nonetheless, there will be diversity of opinions on this front, and that's what makes the enterprise of understanding what heritage is a difficult one, a challenging one, but a necessary one. So therefore, I prefer to say that heritage is not something that just comes down to us, but it's something that is constantly something that is thought about by communities and by societies as a whole at times. And of course, it's not as simple as everybody being on the same page as such, as I will also speak about a little later. So, but it's also, I'd also like to add here that there are certain times or certain places where a large-scale community perception of something that might have played a very important role can make for heritage itself. And of course, we all need to realize that we are in a modern economy, which is a neoliberal market-oriented world, where the heritage making is not just a bunch of elderly citizens talking amongst each other and having a fiat in society saying that this is what we will venerate and this is not what we will do. But we do live with institutionalized forms, and some of these most of these institutional forms, I would say nowadays, are regimented and rule-based and actually run by governments of nations and the respective states that exist. Again, I come back to travel, and here I take the popular quote from the popular sort of tour companion guide, Lonely Planet, I take this quote from a blog that they had in 2017. History is the face of cultures and traditions of a particular place in a particular area. India, being richly endowed with culture, reflects multiple such historical faces, wherein a deep understanding of her age-old traditions and principles can be experienced. Take a tour of some of the most renowned heritage sites of North and South India. Um, this kind of a quote, especially for a foreigner visiting India, suggests that perhaps if they talk to a person on the street, that person ought to know everything about that city or that place. And I don't mean to be dismissive about this, but this essentialized notion that people are representatives of their places has long been critiqued in social anthropology. And archaeologists and anthropological archaeologists are acutely aware in the last 20, 30 years of such characterizations of people visiting other places as such. Nonetheless, we have to recognize that, as I mentioned, in the modern economic sort of situation that we all live in, things like religious pilgrimages, family vacations, longer business travels, all contribute to a popular interest in knowing genuinely about a place and its history. In other words, its heritage, to put it short. Now, at this point, I'll move to the other conception of heritage that dominates the conversations that we all have in middle class and upper middle classes in South Asia, at least, which is the concept of world heritage. And this is the concept that comes up in the United Nations under the UNESCO Convention in 1972, where the explicit mission statement suggests that heritage is our legacy from the past, what we live with today, and what we pass on to future generations. Our cultural and natural heritage are both irreplaceable sources of life and inspiration. Places are unique and diverse, and as unique and diverse as the wilds of East Africa's Serengeti, the pyramids of Egypt, the Great Barrier Reef in Australia, and the Baroque cathedrals of Latin America make up our world's heritage. A previous iteration of this also had the word Taj Mahal in it. What makes the concept of world heritage exceptional is its universal application. World heritage sites belong to all the peoples of the world, irrespective of the territory on which they are located. Now, immediately, a person reading this kind of a mission statement will feel that, wow, this is very noble indeed, of characterizing entire humanity as one, as indeed is the mandate of the United Nations. So if you look at it from the perspective of the institution called the United Nations and the UNESCO, certainly a one planet, one heritage kind of perspective and the mission statement reflecting that makes sense. However, this hardly helps us in, as I believe, in understanding the realities of how heritage decisions are taken in different countries or at different lower levels of, let's say, civic administration. So for instance, there is no recognition that histories of nations that make up the United Nations are diverse and different, and even sometimes antithetical to each other. I can give the example of the colonial experience, for instance, of many, many nations of the world today in Africa, Latin America, Asia, which will not see eye to eye as heritage, the same sort of themes that people who colonized them would consider. And I will mention certain specific examples a little later as well in this regard. Secondly, histories themselves are very complex, and historical personalities are indeed extremely complex characters who cannot be easily brushed in and out of history books. And this, of course, is something that has built on in the academic scholarship of heritage, like I was saying, among people such as Laura Jane Smith, where she sees the connection between cultural heritage and politics as being closely intertwined in the production of the knowledge of the past. And that is hardly inclusive. In fact, it is always happening. So much so that when something is declared a World Heritage Place or a site or a natural region, we might, as the public, engage and interact with these places, but we are not so aware and perhaps not so concerned with what went into those decisions themselves. Nonetheless, these are issues that I'd like to flag and that exist here. So for instance, this recent news item, and undoubtedly I'm just giving one example in the interest of time here, but all of you perhaps read newspapers, online blogs, and articles about what's happening, especially in North America and in UK and in Europe, about um, the perceptions about people who lived as owners of slaves, slavers, so to speak. And statues are being brought down, the demands for statues are being brought down. Sometimes and this is not a new thing, this is not something that's happening only in the last few months, it has been happening in the last few years, especially in North America. And there are certain things that we, as coming from India, as this particular article from the report from the Wire online suggests, as to how Indians can engage with this kind of a debate that's been happening in the West right now. And we are no strangers to this debate ourselves, and one can think of plenty of examples where in our own country, in our own backyards, such issues and themes, statues. I think I won't say more right now. Okay, so I want to now move on to the third section where I'll try to integrate some of these understandings that I'm presenting on heritage with some of the research that I'd already mentioned, with how one can actually integrate some of these things together. Here I must recognize first the government initiatives that are being undertaken, and the latest government initiative that's widely publicized is from the Ministry of Tourism and the Ministry of Culture, which is called the Adopt a Heritage model or initiative. I've taken this bottom thing, how to be a monument mitra, and the icons there from the website called adoptaheritage.in. The concept of Adopt a Heritage goes somewhat like this. So the Ministry of Tourism and the Ministry of Culture, in collaboration with the Archaeological Survey of India, has identified plenty of archaeological sites that need to be developed as tourist and heritage destinations. And the way they envisage the development of these destinations is through the concept called monument mitras. These monument mitras are nothing but companies, mostly private, who have the capital and the wherewithal to simply develop the physical infrastructure and to provide the necessary amenities for the tourist public who comes to these destinations. They do have the mandate to put up certain information about the history, culture, and all of that stuff. But that's not the main priority of Adopt the Heritage. Adopt the Heritage is basically what can be simply said as something that goes from the hands of government institutions such as the Ministry of Culture or the Archaeological Survey of India to an interested entrepreneur who maybe because they have an interest in heritage, or maybe it's part of their corporate social responsibility and all of these things, would invest their resources in developing such things. In fact, the mission statement itself says as much, as you can read here. The project plans to entrust development, upgradation, and maintenance of amenities and facilities to monument mitras, and coupled with innovation and technology interventions. So this has begun in earnest, and there are lots of private companies that have already adopted individual monuments. But as is to be expected, the so-called lesser known monuments, or the monuments further down the list, so to speak, in priority or in popularity, do not have many takers for adoption. And so that's one huge initiative that's there, and I'd welcome a lot of your thoughts on this. And I know there are several archaeologists who have been talking about this more publicly as well. So I'd welcome their comments as well on this regard. But I'd also like to highlight the roles played by a lot of private trusts, museums, universities, and citizens' initiatives. For instance, INTACH itself, I mean, we've been hearing since the first day of the webinar with the introduction, the lovely introduction that of what INTACH does, especially the INTACH Bangalore chapter, which is particularly active, I should say, does. And institutions such as INTACH, which have to, of course, at some levels deal with government agencies, but for the most part, can actually also frame their own ways of looking at heritage or plan to interact with the public or ensure sort of knowledge dissemination with the public, are really doing extremely good service. But one thing is that there hasn't been much collaboration till off late between archaeologists, professional practicing archaeologists, and such cultural entities who are doing this kind of work. And only recently and through ad hoc connections, some of this synergy is beginning to happen. For example, I will cite, this webinar again, NIAS, which Smriti Haricharan, who's co-host of this seminar, who's also part of the heritage studies at her institution, National Institute of Advanced Studies in Bangalore, and who undertake academic programs, are teaming up regularly with INTACH in Bangalore. So this is a successful example that I would say is successfully disseminating in the public sphere a lot of very interesting archaeological information that is coming up. Lots of ways in which alternative imaginations regarding the past and traditions can actually be addressed. So I'm very happy to be doing this webinar on this forum that way. Or there are institutions such as the Aga Khan Trust for Culture. And I should also mention my own university in this regard, which is quite young. And we do have very, very recently started Center for Archaeology, Museums and Heritage Studies. And we've done some outreach programs, mainly for students. But the mandate is to actually popularize archaeology as such. And we've conducted several workshops, as you can see from this slide as well, like ceramic classification. What exactly can archaeologists and people learn from ceramics? What exactly is geographic information systems? People in the tech sector, people in the urban planning sector are quite familiar with geographic information systems as ordering of databases for quick querying of information and sharing of information visually, especially. And this is exactly how archaeologists also look at GIS. But in order to understand better a lot of perceptions about the material landscapes in the past. And of course, the Shiv Nadar, of course, takes pride in being an undergraduate training program for archaeologists as well. But I would not close before actually recognizing and highlighting citizens' initiatives. And there are plenty such initiatives all over the country. But one such initiative that I'm most familiar with is a Bangalore-based citizens initiative, which most of you might actually be familiar with, run by Uday Kumar and Vinay Kumar, among a whole host of team members, who call this initiative Inscriptions of Stones of Bangalore. It started off as trying to actually relocate a lot of the so-called lost inscriptions of this, that talked about the city of Bengaluru, that were published in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. But a lot of these inscriptions that were not to be found, according to Uday Kumar's sort of visits to a lot of these sites. But steadily, he and his team members have been locating, finding, restoring, preserving, and disseminating information regarding these inscriptions through social media and through print and other electronic media as well. So, and like I mentioned, and this I'm sort of winding down towards the end right now, I am interested again in the contemporary, and I had been thinking about this, and I was also encouraged by a few colleagues to think about this, so thank you for that. We are all living in this pandemic, and of course, Smriti's own sort of introduction to this webinar also mentions this, which I think was ruminating in my mind as well, that, what do we do as researchers. All this while I've talked about people interacting with people, but we are now in a situation where that's physically impossible. We are reaching out to each other thanks to these webinar series. But what more can be done? And in this slide, I'd like to just note that the Archaeological Survey of India actually closed down all centrally protected monuments, which number into, I think, more than 4,000 for the entire country, starting March 17th itself. It was only supposed to be till March 31st. But if you go to any of the websites of the centrally protected monuments, and if you want to, you have some time, your lockdown is lifted, and you think that you want to go and see that monument there, and you want a ticket, you can do that online, but it's not available now. So it's still closed. So, so the public interaction right now with physical spaces of the past is actually restricted in this present circumstance. But there are institutions across the world which have gone further, where I choose to put the statement by the Archaeological Institute of America, especially on COVID, where they are very conscious about the role that archaeologists have played, not just the responsibilities of archaeologists today, but also in the past. So archaeologists provide context for these events in the broad scope of human history, offering an evidence-based narrative in moments of fear and uncertainty. In working through material traces of past pandemics, we are keenly aware of the dramatic social consequences that result from the global spread of disease, the permeability of national borders in moments of crisis, and the disproportionate risks to vulnerable communities. The challenge disease poses to urban environments and infrastructure, and the permanent changes that result to economies, demography, cultural. This may as well have been a statement for what's happening here in our country. But I'm happy to note here that archaeology as a discipline in general is recognizing its larger role in the contemporary public life and the role it can play in enlightening, perhaps to some extent, what lives of the people in the past in similar situations might have been like. The one last thing I want to mention about archaeology, as by way of a little criticism of the discipline itself, but also by way of a little bit of hope, is the point about diversity and inclusion. And I take this thanks to actually one of my social media friends who shared this blog post. And I thought it relevant here, where in the current scenario of the Black Lives Matter protests happening in North America, an archaeologist who writes this blog urges American archaeologists to take a hard look at their practices. Although a lot of this material is relevant mostly to North America, I think it resonates with how cultural and historical discrimination and marginalization of communities is a lesson that we can all learn from. So things like structural racism that exists in North America, the recognition of this in archaeological practice. Archaeology that needs to recognize that it is building its publication results and its knowledge about the past on other people's heritage, however we want to see that heritage. And therefore, it is a contested thing. It is not a simple thing at all in that sense. Most archaeology is not done for the benefit of the larger public. And this is true. Most archaeology in most parts of the world is funded publicly through, to put it very simply, taxpayer money. So what accountability do archaeologists have to the larger public is a central question that should concern archaeologists in India as well. We also need to be able to interpret and reinterpret existing sites which have been known for a long time for people today. What do those sites mean today? What it might have meant to a previous generation? This is something that archaeologists and historians in particular are especially well positioned to do so. Heritage conservation should be the element, not so much heritage cultural resource management. And this is a feature specific to North America, where, just to say in brief, cultural resource management is basically a concept where you have private companies who hire archaeologists, basically archaeologists who form themselves into companies whose services are hired by people who want to develop lands, for infrastructure development and so on and so forth. And their they need to get a certification from archaeologists that there is nothing of historical importance or heritage under that land so that it can be dug. Now, it does work well with certain caveats, but generally speaking, there has been an increasing disillusionment in North American archaeological practice with regards to cultural resource management as not being critical enough of the issues regarding heritage and whose history and all of that. So there is a plea now to look at heritage conservation rather than simply looking at the economic side of viability. Okay, we need to make the past viable as much as the present project of infrastructure development viable as such. It's not as simple as that. People are looking for more nuanced conversations. And of course, the last but not the least, one cannot expect marginalized communities of the past or the present to point out structural discrimination such as racism or casteism in archaeology. And this is something that also takes off from, I think, Carol Upadhyay's paper yesterday, where she was looking at the urban situation, urban development situation in peri-urban Bangalore, as she called it, where Dalit communities have become also part of the real estate, but also are activists trying to highlight the problems of historic discrimination that they have faced in the marginalization, especially to do with land. So let me conclude finally with these thoughts, and this is my last slide. So coming back to this, what constitutes heritage? Apart from, of course, the recognition of tangible and intangible heritage, I didn't speak much about intangible heritage, but that's maybe something that we can raise in discussion. The main questions might be, whose past ought to be heritagized? And how does one balance considerations of representations of the marginalized with the popular? Or even, is this even the right approach to look at heritage management or heritage making? And I'd like to just finish by this saying that, archaeologists are actually in a position today to provide sophisticated understandings of the past, but they also need to be more engaged with disseminating such knowledge among non-specialists and the interested public. Social and institutional frameworks have to be created to ensure much more inclusive participatory processes than have been current in the situation. So I'll stop there. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Hemanth, for that very, very, very nice wrap up. And I loved how you gave this very lovely up-to-date snapshot of research in South Indian archaeology and history, and then how you very gently, I might add, suggested that we should think about heritage and how it is contested, and we need to think about questions like whose heritage and who decides all that. And then you, of course, linked all that with the public. So a really lovely wrap-up session, I think, it's just been perfect. We do have a few questions for you.
Sure.
Your last slide spoke about dissemination, and I think that's so important. So as you rightly mentioned, this webinar series between NIAS and INTACH, which I must add is also a citizens organization. They are all, they're all volunteers here.
Right.
So this is one way of dissemination, of course, but what are archaeologists doing about, if anything, like how should archaeologists, or should archaeologists also think about dissemination in the field?
Yeah, that's a question that is very relevant for the practitioner of archaeology. And in my limited experience so far, I think archaeologists will do very well to regularly invite people to their ongoing research projects and to have certain sessions dedicated to describing or making presentations to the interested people, whether it's school students, older, young adults, or just interested members of the public who want to come and learn something. And also, in fact, engage with them if they would like to participate in some of these processes themselves on a volunteer basis. Now, that latter part actually is not happening in India so far as I'm aware. The volunteer-based archaeology concept does not exist here as much as it exists in Australia, North America, and Europe. You have senior citizens, for instance, regularly volunteering on archaeological digs. They go there and stand for a few hours in the sun, like, screaming through material artifacts, and they know something about what they have to look for. But in the process, they have this tangible experience of what it is to know something about one's past. It could be somebody else's past. But this engagement and the kind of the mental approach that they can develop into understanding what archaeologists do, I think it can be better highlighted through volunteer archaeology approach. I think that's something that we have to take a next step on. Yeah, that's what I can think of for the moment.
Smriti, did you want to add anything?
No, I actually completely agree with what Hemanth said. I do think, I mean, I think there are people visiting sites, like going back to Kiradi. Like during the excavation, there was a huge number of, I can't tell you how many, there was like hundreds of people at the site. It was extremely popular, clearly. But at the same time, how successfully and I have to say, Tamil Nadu archaeology was extremely welcoming. And they're very warm, and they're asking people to come, and they're willing to talk to them. When we were there were multiple people who took videos for YouTube channels and things like that. So, but how effectively are we disseminating in the field? But also, how inclusive are we of local communities who are living around the sites? Like, are we talking to them about it? Because it is literally in their backyard. Right. And I think therefore we should be much more like take on a higher onus on ourselves in terms of that, which unfortunately I don't think we're really successfully doing right now.
Unlike some countries elsewhere where they do actually make an effort to disseminate, particularly to the communities living around the excavation. Yeah. Okay. There's a question from Pankaj who says, how does one address the conflict of perception of significance in the case of a place like Virupaksha Bazaar in Hampi? It's living, but there's also a buried heritage, a buried past there. How does one address conflicts like this?
Yeah, no, that's a very good question as well, and something that all archaeologists in India have to deal with. How does one address that? I would say that it's complicated in the sense that one has to have the physical space itself to be able to do, let's say, excavations, if that's what's required of that research project. To understand better, something of a past construction, or the period of construction of two particular buildings, and so on and so forth, and yet be sensitive enough that it's a lived space. It is a constant negotiation. It's a negotiation that, practically speaking, can only perhaps work in a few ways, and one of which could be that one really has constant dialogue with the local people around who utilize that space regularly. These could even be people like sheep and goat herders, which very commonly traverse the landscapes of North Karnataka, where most of the temples and all of these are. Yes. Yes. Or the banana sort of plantation that exists, or the coconut plantation that exists, which is the case in Hampi, for instance, or the paddy field that is next door, or something like that. So there is no way out but to actually have kind of a confidence building sort of thing to make sure that you have certain finite time to be able to do your dig, your excavation, and to be involving and including those people in some, not just in a way to understand their past, but also in terms of to make sure that they don't have too much of a financial loss. And that's a very huge consideration. All excavation projects that require permits might receive permits from the Archaeological Survey of India or the relevant authorities, but ultimately it comes down to how the researchers negotiate with the people who live on that space of land. And that lived space comes from their occupation, their financial the sustenance that comes off of those lands or those areas. And so that has to be addressed. That cannot not go unaddressed, is my opinion. And there are ways in which that can be sustained.
Okay. There is a slightly broader question also here. Going back to the idea of the series, which is about history, heritage, and archaeology in South India. So would you say it sounds, especially from your wrap-up, you spoke about all the research which is happening in South India today in so many, in archaeology and history. So there's clearly a lot happening, but would you agree that there's less awareness about this among common people in South India? Like among non-historians and non-archaeologists, there seems to be less awareness about South Indian history. So would you agree with that? And if yes, then why?
Would I agree with it? That's a little hard one for me because I'm in the field. So I don't observe it from the outside too often, which is actually not saying much about myself.
So I think a part of this is because we have been getting comments from some people who attended. We've got this really varied audience. Right. There are researchers, but there are also people, like even today, there are some people who've written and saying, I had no idea about history, but I've attended these and I've learned a lot of things. So some of the things the researchers spoke about, many people have told us, we had no clue about this. How come we didn't learn about this in school?
Sure. Yeah.
So, I mean, this is what prompts me to ask you this question.
No, thanks for clarifying that, because that takes me back to the thought that I started this presentation with, which was the history books such as Neelkanth Shastri's History of South India. So I would say that the two covers that I had were two different editions of the same book. The latest edition is the 4th edition of that book, which has a foreword by a foremost scholar of South Indian history, Professor Champak Lakshmi, who's done a lot to sort of not just do the academic research on socioeconomic histories of South India, but also in her own way try to popularize the discipline of history and create awareness about academics in a larger public domain. Sort of being a kind of a public intellectual slash researcher in that sense. And I mentioned Professor Neelkanth Shastri's book here again because a lot of what, let's say, the people in South who went to schools in South India would remember are the histories of the Cholas, the Pallavas, the Chalukyas, Rashtrakutas, which were all researched by essentially two scholars, Neelkanth Shastri and Professor Ghulam Yazdani. And everybody else, because these were the two stalwarts who wrote synthesis about the histories and archaeologies and cultures of the South Indian past. Not to say that there aren't other scholars and there weren't other scholars who were also equally measured and very articulate in the past of South India, but a lot of what our textbooks picked up came from this, and it sort of became ossified in our curricula in subsequent generations. And therefore, that sort of allows me to sort of say that, perhaps this is why a lot of the recent research of the last 30 years has not yet found much sort of reflection in public information and public knowledge. Of course, and I should also add that, as you would have all noticed, a lot of the people I cited who are doing this research also are researchers from abroad. They do spend a very limited amount of time, which is basically in their academic schedules. They come, they do their research, do their little bit, and they have been doing public outreach, I should also say. Many of them have been. But the time that they have to spend on this kind of public outreach is also very limited. So maybe that has something to do with it as well, and I hope that changes also.
Kumaran Ilangovan has a question that kind of links to this. He says, on the question of whose history and on diversity, do you think there are specific groups of people's histories that have been very rarely looked at or have not been part of the larger historical narrative of India and Indians?
Oh yes, for sure. I mean, if we want to take it at a very, very general level, the histories and archaeologies of people who did not control wealth and power. So at one level, at the most general level, we are very, very far from research into those kinds of communities of people. But for all the sort of awareness that we show in our contemporary lives about discrimination based on caste and gender in Indian society in general, I would say that the research on this by archaeologists mainly, less so historians, but mainly archaeologists, is really very little. So gender in archaeology, for example, is being researched in northern Indian archaeology, for example, by people like Professor Jayamenon and Supriya Verma, who also Smriti knows very well. But in the southern context, it's just beginning. Praveena has done some work. Namita Sugandhi is also doing some. But I would generally say that many of us who have been trained in this discipline called anthropological archaeology are a little bit more familiar with the general feminist critiques of the academic profession itself, that we try and incorporate some of these things. Nonetheless, the research is really wanting as far as the so-called marginalized communities are concerned. And I mean, I can't even go about listing who the marginalized communities are because there is so many.
There's so many, yeah. Kind of linked to this, a specific question for an archaeologist. So Uma Tanuku wants to know, how do you find evidence of caste in excavations, like beyond, beyond trade and say habitations or something? Is there anything particularly that will tell you this is a particular caste?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. In fact, the notion of caste, as social anthropologists used it in South Asia for the better part of the last 50, 60 years, was also actually very static and I would say a little ossified in its own self. It was like a self-contained category with a minimum recognition of movements in caste categories, but nonetheless, archaeologists who were reading such literature were trying to map on their material evidence directly onto caste communities. So if a particular material of vessel was found, like brass vessels. Brass vessels typically do have in modern memories and of upper caste people a kind of a specific connotation, that only specific kinds of groups within specific caste communities can also have those kinds of vessels, as opposed to somebody who uses an earthenware pot or a perishable or a vessel made out of a perishable material like leaves or something like that. So there is a general sort of idea that material culture can be, or rather, this kind of a social stratification that we call caste can have some kind of a reflection in material culture, and yet the specifics of identifying the caste is almost close to impossible. I would say that would be presumptuous of archaeologists to say that we have found this caste or that caste in the archaeological record per se. Yes, certain socio-economic and socio-political formations, which sort of obviously map on to certain caste communities, can be surmised from the material remains. But what the archaeologists actually will talk about is the details of the socio-political formations and the economic processes or the economic resources that were accessible to that local population. That can, at a stretch, stand as a proxy for the kinds of hierarchical relations, and sometimes one of those hierarchical relations could be caste.
I'm going to put a question to you, which is from Alvin Shiv. It's a personal question. What made you choose archaeology?
Oh, wow. I think I became interested in history pretty late in my schooling. I would say not before my 11th and 12th, actually. That was because I had good teachers, and somehow history just happened to be a subject but I was getting marks in. But once I really got interested in it, I did an undergraduate program which had a pass course in Bangalore, as we all know, in Bangalore, history, economics, and political science, and that really opened for me this the social sciences and humanities in general for me. But the fact that I had fantastic history teachers really focused my interest on the past. The economics, the politics, everything was fascinating and interesting to me from the perspective of the past. Now, when I went into a master's program, this was in the Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi, that's when I particularly started to take a liking for archaeology, because I did see that the historians' methods of using archives and documented histories, while fascinating, and I remain interested in all of that as well. My particular interest was veering towards understanding tangible remains and landscapes. And that's how I got into archaeology.
That's very interesting that you say that. Actually, I should just mention here, there's a G. Venkat Narayan who has a comment here about how important it will be for history to be taught differently in schools for people to get interested in archaeology. So it's really nice to hear you say this. Yeah,
I agree. Yes.
Okay, Hemanth, there are lots more questions, but unfortunately we don't have enough time. So thank you, Hemanth, for this. Smriti, would you like to say a few words?
Yeah, I should. Thank you so much. It was really, really
You're very
great.
welcome.
I think it was.
I'm very happy to be here. Thanks.
No, I think it was also nice because you brought together so many things of all that we've been talking about and contextualized it constantly with both the series and a lot of what we've otherwise been discussing in this as well. So that was really, really great. And I think, one may think listening to this talk that it should have come much earlier on, but I think one of the things Meera and I did think about is the reason we thought of back and forth is that we don't keep it as linear, but it kind of, and hopefully that didn't confuse people too much, but made it more interesting.
I hope so, yeah. I'd like to just add a shout out to all the participants, not just for today, but also through the 2 weeks. Thank you all for your questions and your contributions. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess then I have the task of wrapping up this 2-week course here. So not course, a series of lectures, and I really hope that all of you have enjoyed it. If you'll have any feedback about the series in any way, please do let us know. And thank you for being here, and we hope to see you in some future series as well. Yeah. Also, yes, there have been a few questions, actually lots of questions. People have asked whether we're going to upload these on YouTube. Most likely, yes, we will, almost all, except for maybe a few speakers who are a little who are not very happy with the idea of being having the talks uploaded on YouTube. So yes, they will be on YouTube, and we'll let you know when they are put up. So thank you once again. Thank you, Hemanth, and thank you everybody here. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.